Good morning, everyone. It's 9:30, so we'll start this meeting and declare the Audit and Risk Council Committee meeting AR22/3 open, and welcome everyone present. On Zoom, we have various councillors and also independent member Stuart Henderson joining us. I'll just remind everyone that this meeting is being live streamed and it'll be recorded, so please take care of what you say. Apologies, I have apologies from Councillor Margaret Murray-Benge and Councillor Kevin Marsh. Call for mover, Councillor Granger, Councillor Thwaites. All those in favour, say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Apologies for lateness, and I'm not sure we'll keep it. There are no late items. Are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you. There are no public excluded items. I'm not aware of anyone wanting public forum. So before we get going with the meeting proper, I'll ask Stuart Henderson to perhaps say a few words and introduce himself. He was appointed by council just recently and joins us as our independent member. So Stuart, perhaps you can give an introduction, please.
Kia ora, James. Ena mana ena reo, e rao rangatira ma. Nā mihi manahau kia koto. No taronga aho. E noho ara aro kia pakari. Ko Stuart Henderson aho. Firstly, I'll apologise. My pronunciation was probably as bad as when I was at Tauranga Boys College and was politely asked to leave French, as I was unfortunately murdering that language. And I apologise if my pronunciation has not been up to scratch. I'm originally from Tauranga and have had an association with Western Bay of Plenty District Council for the better part of 20 years. In the days when Glenn Snellgrove was your chief executive, and also during the time of Miriam Taras. Yet to meet you, John, but you're a council that was near where I lived, and I have a father that lives in Katikati at the moment, so definitely very dear to my heart. I've had 35 years in financial markets. Previously was a partner with PwC, and I've had a 25-year relationship with local government in New Zealand, in particular in the area of Treasury and with the LGFA. But my current work is in governance on various advisory boards and also with other councils and in the area of audit and risk. And thank you very, very much for having me. And as you're independent, I'm very privileged to have that honour, and I really look forward to meeting you all. I had anticipated to come down this week, and these were my olives that I'd brought for council and staff, but I'll have to leave that for the next time I'm through, and hopefully everybody is an olive eater.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. It's nice to have you on board, and we welcome you to this committee. So moving on, we now have the, on page 7, we have the Bancorp Treasury update and presentation. And for that, we have Suresh Ranchod and Ross Woodfield presenting. Do you want to introduce or take it?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, elected members. We've requested Bancorp to come in just to give an update on markets and interest rates, just in relation to risk with our council. So at an operational level, we meet with Bancorp on a very regular basis to discuss our council, our positions, and the ongoing risk issues. And we thought it was timely, given what's happening in the market, for them to come in, just give a bit of an update about the things that we consider, and enable you to see what we discuss with Bancorp. So I'll leave Ross and Suresh to present their view on where things are heading. Thanks, Ross and Suresh.
Ross, Suresh, are you there?
Hi, can you hear us now?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Sorry, apologies for that. Settings on. Yeah, thank you, David. Let me just share our slides so you know what we're talking about. Right. Can everybody see those?
Yes.
Yep. Good. Yep, perfect. Okay, so obviously, inflation around the world is one of the biggest topics at the moment, and there's a multitude of factors that are causing the spike in inflation. Obviously, hangover from COVID, supply chain shortages, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sharp rise in oil prices. But we expect that the next sort of 6 to 12 months could see a very sharp reversal in these inflation numbers, and we're sort of starting to see commodities really retreat from their highs. So at the top here, you can see this red line is oil, wheat, which is kind of indicative of global food prices, aluminium, and things like copper, which is a bellwether for global growth. So, these commodities were probably naturally going to come off their highs, but with the really sharp rise in interest rates around the world and the talk of recession, we're starting to see consumer demand really drop off, which is obviously reducing demand for commodity prices, which should hopefully bring those inflation numbers down from their peaks. But nevertheless, central banks have obviously been caught behind the 8 ball, and there's been this massive global response, which is a tightening or raising of interest rates. And obviously the RBNZ is no different. You can see they are that thicker sort of blue line there, taking our OCR from 0.25, currently at 2.5%. And a lot of the other central banks have quite quickly caught up to where the RBNZ is. So yeah, it's not a unique situation in New Zealand that we're facing. Indeed, the council as a borrower facing higher interest rates is it's not unique to you or to New Zealand. It's a whole global story at the moment. And the cycle isn't finished yet. We've seen 2.25% of hikes so far, and this orange area is the forecast, current market forecast for another sort of percent and a half of hikes. So this chart just shows the various cycles since the OCR was introduced in 1999. So each time the cycle finishes, kind of reset back to zero, so that you can see each cycle in context with the previous hiking and cutting cycles. So at the moment, the GFC, we saw a protracted 3+% hiking cycle, but that was over about 42 months. 42 months, yeah, thank you. Whereas this, we're talking about 18 months and doing even more. So by far the most aggressive hiking cycle we've seen. Now, obviously, that has large implications for borrowers, particularly mortgage holders. So we will see, a lot of pain in the consumer side of, or the consumer demand part of the economy. Obviously, borrowers are going to feel that effect. Going from mortgages around 2.5% up to 5 and 6%. It's going to hurt. as I said, not a unique situation in New Zealand. So here's the projected path for various central banks around the world. So currently our OCR at 2.5%, expected to get a little over 4%. And then we're starting to see cuts priced into the forward curve. So the market's expecting the OCR to hit 4% by the end of the year. And then sometime next year, we'll actually see a cut, which means that we go from a hiking to a cutting cycle extremely quickly. Going back into this sort of context, you can see here starting to tail off at the top, whereas in the past we saw sort of gradual hikes and then a pause and then a cutting cycle, whereas this is going to flip from one to the other very fast.
Just while we're on that chart, I'll have my 2 cents worth here. Just certainly in the past 10 years, we've only ever tried to hike twice, and that was, you can see it there, very small jump up in 2011. That was the earthquake, pre the Christchurch earthquake, and then we removed those. And then in 2014, we managed 1% of hikes, and then subsequent to that, we've been cutting ever since. So, it's been quite an extraordinary cycle that has eventuated certainly over the last 10 years. And this move to bring interest rates back up to obviously deal with inflation is at the extremes that anybody could have ever predicted. And I always quite like to highlight, from the period from 2015 to 2019-20, we'd been cutting all the way along. And most people here in this room on this call probably wouldn't be able to acknowledge why the central bank here in New Zealand was having to cut. It was just, a prolonged slowness in our economy, yet our central bank just kept stimulating the economy by cutting and cutting and cutting. And that we were at 1% before the pandemic. And now we're trying to get a cash rate back to 4%, which is going to be very hard.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the expectation that inflation has peaked, and then obviously the subsequent potential recession that we're facing, that's caused interest rate swaps to come back from their highs. So we're just comparing the New Zealand and Australian curves here. The dash line is the peak of the market back in the middle of June. And you can see, interest rate swaps are at 4.5%, and really flat. Whereas now the short end's a fraction higher, but the long end is certainly well off. And you can see that inversion that we're starting to see. So, the 2-year or the 1-year swap is the highest, and then everything else is lower than that.
So that was a 1% fall. So that's quite extreme. That's a lot of volatility in a short period of time. And, it's even more pronounced in the Australian curves, which are showing in green, the green dotted to the green solid, which seems to be settling well below our projected rate. So, we think these rates are just pricing in the worst case scenario, and the risks are still skewed, significantly skewed to the downside once we've finished this tightening.
Yeah, and outright interest rate swaps. Here's the history of swap rates over the last decade or so, decade plus. So you can see those two hiking cycles Suresh mentioned in 2011 and 2014, and then basically the subsequent cutting, over the next 5 or 6 years. And then since then, this is the volatility that we're seeing at the top of the market, which is quite remarkable, really. We're swinging between 350 and 450 back to 350 in a very short space of time. So the market's really sort of trying to decide, how bad the next 6 to 12, 18 months could be, and whether central banks will get a hold of inflation, whether inflation will come down, or whether they have to do more to try and temper inflation. So really interesting time in the markets, and I think for council, thankfully we haven't had to borrow too much over the last couple of years. Whereas now we're facing a situation where we're right at the top of the market. The market's starting to price in interest rate cuts. So we kind of just need to get over this peak. And, thankfully, council can put off the borrowing that it's planning to do until the early part of next year, when we will start to see, when we likely have seen the peak. We'll know whether we're facing a recession or whether inflation is still out of control and the central banks still have to hike. My expectation is that naturally, given that those commodity prices, also the way the CPI calculation works, you start dropping out. It's a 12-month rolling calculation. So these big monthly numbers that we saw a year ago, those will drop out of the calculation. New months coming in are likely to be less than them. Therefore, CPI will naturally start tailing off, and then the markets will kind of breathe a sigh of relief and then look beyond the hiking cycle to the cutting cycle, and this potential recession that's a result of such high interest rates. So when the council does need to go to market, we're probably going to see interest rates a little bit lower than where we are at the moment. Although the front end of the curve, obviously the OCR will be really high at that point, but everything will be pointing downwards as we head into that cutting cycle. And then finally, you've seen this chart, I think.
It hasn't been updated for quite some time. It is sorry, Ross, but this is the important one for us, and this is the RBNZ's estimate of neutral, what the neutral OCR is. And, over time, it has degraded quite significantly. Neutral now, and in most major central banks around the world, is around 2%. So that's where the OCR will probably end up having to settle after we go through this extreme hiking cycle. And the shaded area is the potential range or estimates of where neutral could reside. And according to the Reserve Bank's work, at the end of 2021, that neutral rate was somewhere between 1% and 3%. And if we're taking the cash rate to 4%, it's only natural to assume that the next move will be down. So, and even the Fed, the US, which one of the largest economies in the world, they see neutral around 2.5 anyway. So, what we're having to do to kill inflation will and eventually see us settle back lower. And that curve inversion we're starting to see already certainly starts telling us that that story should play out.
Suresh, I've got a question from the mayor, so I'll just let him ask now.
Yes.
Thanks, Suresh and Ross. If you go back to the previous slide, please, where you see that the high end around 2007, 2008, some of us are old enough to remember it's the 18 to 20% in our time. Given what we're talking about here as our hedge rate, is it that serious really when you go back to 2006, 7, and we're hedging out some time? I don't think we should be afraid. We've got a pretty strong balance sheet, and debt is really the way local government works to get the intergenerational funding. Do you think we should be severely concerned or just aware of what's in front of us?
I think we just need to be aware of what's playing out at this time. If you look at this chart, you make a good point. We're not going back to rates where the cash rate's 8%. We'd all be in a lot of trouble then. But certainly since the GFC, the trend for interest rates have been lower, and nobody would have ever fathomed that we would have hit a 0.25 cash rate in the middle of the pandemic. And so, we're not going back to those levels. And it's if you do even think about what Western Bay has been doing for a large number of years, it's been doing little bits of hedging, but debt has hardly grown. And that's been our focus, is managing what the expectations for debt is. And so, over time, Western Bay of Plenty has enjoyed low rates, by doing less hedging, although we're quite reasonably highly hedged, because the debt hasn't materialised. So that one still plays out for us. So when we're thinking about what's going to happen or when we should hedge, we're also concerned about the implications of Three Waters, because Three Waters has the potential to take out debt, and that will even further reduce the need to focus on hedging at this time. And I think we've just been made aware that from the DIA that they will leave interest rate hedging in the councils. So that's another thing that we may have to deal with in 23, 24, if we've still got swaps, but our debt comes. So we're thinking about a number of things. But from an interest rate perspective, I don't think there's a lot to be worried about, because, 4.5 or 3.5 at the moment appears to be the peak of where markets could end up in a short term, and then the tilt is to the downside.
Yeah, thank you.
Sir Schwartz, are you finished, or did you got any more to go?
Yep, that was the last one.
Thank you.
That was it. Okay. In which case, I'll open the floor for questions. Councillor Granger.
Thanks, James. Ross, you mentioned at the start that you're expecting a sharp decrease in inflation in the next 12 months, and mentioned commodity prices falling. There was no mention of wage pressure inflation, or the fact that central banks have been printing money like it's going out of style over the last few years. How are those two factors going to play into that prediction?
Yeah, look, let me just clarify. We certainly could see a sharp reversal in CPI. The other situation is that CPI stays uncomfortably high for the central banks, probably not around the 9% that we're seeing at the moment, but certainly 3 to 5%, which would certainly give some central bank nightmares. Wage inflation certainly is causing that kind of feedback loop into headline inflation, and that's what the central banks are trying to stop. Yeah, they're trying to be a bit of a circuit breaker by and the RBNZ talks about getting employment back to its maximum sustainable level, i.e. we're above maximum sustainable levels, so they want to see some unemployment to get the unemployment number back to 4%, whereas at the moment it's at 3.2%, which they think causes too much wage inflation, which leads back to headline inflation. So the central banks are going to do all they can, because if the economy's gone into recession, well, that's a situation they could deal with afterwards. Their first priority is certainly to get inflation back. In terms of the sheer amount of money that they printed, yeah, I totally disagree with their response to it. That we're never facing a financial crisis, so it didn't need the $20+ trillion worth of stimulus that the global central banks put into the markets. 3 times what we saw in the GFC, which was a financial crisis. But they are trying to remove that at a rate of knots. But that's going to take some time. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And there are certainly factors that could keep inflation quite high. But a large part of the reason we saw high inflation was because of oil prices. And those are back to, sort of $90 a barrel. Your petrol prices coming down at the pump. I think the US had 50 consecutive days of lower petrol prices over the last month or two. So, yeah, we are seeing signs that inflation has peaked. It's just a question of, how quickly can it come down? And the other factor that might drive it down even further is obviously the consumer demand that's being choked off because of the raising interest rates. But supply chains are getting back to normal throughout the world. So that's going to cause, the goods, the flow of goods is going to continue or catch up to where it should have been. So we're going to see a lot more discounting of, you know, consumer goods in shops because companies have, you know, retailers have ordered too much, you know, thinking there'll be a big backlog, and suddenly you get this glut of consumer products. So that could drive prices down even further.
Mayor Webber.
Thanks. And I'd be interested in Stuart Henderson, your comments on this as well. Given what we've gone through in the last 10 years with the global financial crisis and the pandemic, and the pressure that's going on central governments now to get out of their 3-year cycle, like that they've given Kaingaora the ability to fund stuff over 30 years, and there's pressure being applied on NZ Transport or Waka Kotahi to do the same sort of thing. Do you see the government as getting its head into this space of infrastructure costs? You can't manage them on a 3-year cycle. You've got to get into the 30-year cycle. Do you see that altering some of the funding thoughts or processes going forward?
Hi, that's an interesting question, because there hasn't really been a lot of foresight around that, especially over the last couple of years, where if we think even about the Three Waters, I mean, Three Waters has come at a time when arguably New Zealand has been at the point where long-term infrastructure borrowing would have been at its historically most attractive time and level. You know, when we had long-term interest rates at under 2%, and we were able to enjoy all up funding costs that were historically at extraordinarily low levels. You know, you've got a extraordinarily high and material shift and change occurring with the Three Water reform to that forward debt projection, not only with councils, but obviously with central government in terms of the response to that reform. So one could say that there's been a very big opportunity loss or opportunity cost around that. In terms of, I mean, I guess my question to Saraz and to Ross is more about inflation, and that the views being expressed on inflation by Bancorp and by the market is certainly one that it seems to have that it's plateaued or has peaked, and I just wonder what what's the upside risk if markets' interpretation of central banks' behaviours and the actual reality of inflation being potentially more sticky than being considered. If you get that wrong, what's the upside risk to council? Because I would imagine that that's going to have a significant bearing on yield curves around the world. It's not about whether we're all right or wrong. It's more about, you know, what's the degree of risk about where, if we've got long-term interest rates now here at 3.5%, what's the risk to the upside on that if we all get this wrong about inflation being more sticky than one would like it to be? And I just say, I saw a really interesting chart. It's one of my favourite charts. It's a 100-year chart that tracks New Zealand inflation with that of the US. And at no point in the last 100 years does New Zealand's inflation rate fall below that of the US. And i.e., when the US catches a cold, we get the flu, as do most other countries around the world. And I just wondered that if we get this wrong with the US, and that if in US inflation is stickier and harder to combat than is being considered, what are the consequences of that, please, Ross and Suresh?
I'll just quickly say here, I mean, we have been considering the outlook for interest rates in the context of West Bay for quite some time, but debt hasn't materialised. So hedging at the short end is relatively quite high, and there is some duration out there, 7 years plus, and there's still these growth plans I think if I'm correct, we've only added to fixed rate hedging probably once in the last 5 years because of that downward projection. And Western Bay continues to sit on cash as well. So that's been the risk management strategy because we're reasonably hedged and debt hasn't materialised. So that's kind of made our work a little bit easier on that front. And obviously, certainly in the last 12 years prior to this period, interest rates have only gone one way down. So yes, we've been thinking about that. Secondly, if we're wrong about interest rates, then, trying to hedge at these highs, which are now outside the ranges of neutral, what will end up being the case is that Western Bay pays the floating rate. So, we're not, that's what the hedging strategy's been. We just don't see value in hedging it. If we're wrong, and rates stay up here at 3%, 4%, whatever, 4.5%, then they're going to be there and we're going to have to pay that in a floating market. What I'm more worried about is what that's going to do to households when mortgage rates are around 6.5%, and potentially the threat of 7%. And we've got a housing market that's imploding already. And so, can they housing markets sustain those sort of levels for next 3, 4, 5 years? Probably not. And that's where we see that skilter down. Now, we advise not only councils, but corporates, lots of corporates. And what's been interesting, certainly in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, is corporate debt hasn't changed that much. And in fact, agri debt is now negative. Agri debt is lower today than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago. The housing market debt has just ballooned through the roof. So that's where all the risks lie. So that's kind of our sort of stop point, is that if we're wrong, well, we'll be floating. I can't fathom interest rates or an OCR above 5 or towards 6 or 7. That takes us back to levels pre-GFC, and our housing debt is a completely different dynamic now. So we'd be in all sorts of trouble, I suspect.
Thank you, Suresh.
No, I just wanted to add one question further that was asked of Stuart around, all this other stuff that's going long-term funding and, Wakatari, etc. It's interesting that we're starting to see more and more popping up around the sort of long-term infrastructure assets, and it's starting to obviously push it off balance sheet and off balance sheet for councils. Councils, and Western Bay is an exception, but a lot of councils have, I think, are reaching the limit on debt and the ability for ratepayers to pick up the tab on that debt. We've certainly noticed here in Auckland, when our rates bills came out last week, and there's plenty of headlines on that. So we're going to see more and more effort trying to take stuff off council balance sheets and fund it separately. Now, when you do see that, and I've been involved with a few of these things where they're 30-year funding, there's a lot of work that has to go on in the background, and these rates can potentially be set for 30 years and don't always look that great. But I think the principle here is that, they're going to try to get things off balance sheet.
So when we say off balance sheet, do you mean things like the whole Three Waters reforms and also the infrastructure funding for housing that Tauranga is thinking about doing?
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yep.
Councillor Daly.
Suresh, on that last point, you guys must have done a bit of study on the Three Waters reform. In regard to Scottish Water's claims of increased efficiency, more ability to borrow money compared to the status quo with councils, do you agree with those claims from Scottish Water that, they could potentially borrow twice the sort of money that councils can in the long term?
Now, I'll be upfront here. We haven't done analysis around the merits of, taking the assets out and doing them separately. I mean, we have been representing our individual clients that we know that have an asset, they've got related debt and related hedging. So no, I can't really give comment on whether that Scottish proposal will be any better. But from what I understand, there is a cast of thousands in the background involved in this process trying to work this out. So yeah, sorry, I can't offer anything if it's going to be a good idea or a bad idea. But what we did learn at local authority day a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of, including representatives from here, we were looking for information from the DIA and people like Maffick who are working behind the scenes on funding for Three Waters, is what does that mean for councils? And we didn't really get what we wanted, because I still don't think they're there yet. But only in the last couple of weeks we've received information that they'll take the assets. The debt they haven't really talked about, but there'll be a make good on the debt or how that plays out. But the derivatives or the hedging will remain with the council. So that has quite significant implications for us, because if you take away the debt but not the related hedges, we've got a mismatch. So we're still continuing to try to work out. We'll get information on how that's going to play out. But it feels like there's going to continue to be controversy around this, and we will not know what's going to happen until 3 days before settlement, because I think that will stop, the pushback.
And it answers your question as well, Councillor Daly. I think Standard & Poor's has done a lot of work around that. So the Bangor guys probably aren't the right guys to ask that, but the Standard & Poor's people probably are. Yes, James.
Suresh, Ross, thanks. Good presentation. Just a quick one. Have you heard in your conversations with regards to the mismatch of debt and hedging, whether the government are expecting that we use the no worse off funding to offset any hedging losses as a result of that, as we unwind them?
No, I haven't heard anything.
Okay. Independent member Henderson.
Thank you. I'll just allow that. I was really interested in your comment about the DIA announcing the fact that the derivatives would not be being transferred. How did this information come through?
I think it was just by email, and I think I saw an email. The first thing I heard was on the wires.
Is this in the last couple of weeks?
Yes.
Yeah. Last week.
That's really interesting. So I had conversations with one of the board, the advisory board members, about that very subject, and it was their intention that the derivatives would be being novated or cancelled. So that's a really interesting piece of news, and it doesn't seem consistent with the process that is being involved in relation to the Three Water debt. Thank you. If you could kindly drop me a note on that, I would really appreciate it, because I think it's a significant component of risk that council will need to think about in terms of the shift and change to the balance sheet as a result of the Three Waters. And I mean, I know this council is going to be potentially looking at 80% of its debt coming off post 2024. And it's going to be a very, very material component that's going to impact on a number of other different risks as well. Yes, if you could, that's an interesting piece of information that's the DIA have come through with, if that's the case.
And just to further on that, Stuart, they just didn't clarify whether there was actually a make good in there. So they're only talking about one component. And last year it was a huge issue because all the hedges were out of the money. This year we're in the money. So they're not saying, well, we're going to, yeah. So there is, what they're saying is that they don't want to deal with the swaps. So we may have to make a call. If there is a make good, either way, we could choose to keep the hedges or close them out, but there has to be, or now they're in the money, we probably have to pay them, if you know what I mean, off the value of the asset. So all these things are still in limbo and we're just not getting, the clarity yet.
Yeah. So Suresh, can I just ask there what kind of value we're talking about there that might be needed to be paid?
Maybe I could. The kind of value we're talking about here is that if we look at council's current swap portfolio, and if those swaps are linked to Three Water debt, and if the debt is extinguished essentially by the Three Water entity, then the swaps associated with that debt will be revalued at that time. And at that time, there was one way that the Three Waters could either assume the swaps by way of innovation, but I think that's proving to be rather difficult for them for reasons that I won't go into now, but very happy to at a later stage, James. So as what Ross and Saraz are saying is that it's likely, and I would be very surprised if they do not make good, because it will be a factor that your debt associated with Three Water assets is the sum of two parts. It is the sum of the debt on the one side and the interest rate risk management on the other. And so it'll be a case of that being neutral. So they'll mark what we call mark to market those swaps. And if those swaps are, as Saraz has just said, out of the money, that means that if they are more expensive for council relative to the market at the time, then they will make good and give that payment to Western Bay Plenty District Council on top of the debt the debt assumption.
Thank you, Stuart. Matt. Councillor Thwaites.
Did he really answer the question though, to give a range of the impact of that swap?
Well, David will have the mark to market currently, or at 30 June.
I can comment on that, Suresh. So for the last several years on our books at year end, we have had a liability of anywhere up to $10 million representing the unrealized loss on the value of the swaps. Because interest rates have risen so much in the last few years, this year we will actually be showing an asset of about 800,000.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Weber. Okay. Okay. Well, any further questions? Mayor Weber.
Well, it's a comment more than anything. I think I won't be here for your next presentation, but I think it's absolutely critical that as we get closer to the Three Waters resolution, we understand the implications for us. My understanding is we were one of the few councils that was going to benefit from the Three Waters because of the state of the nation of where we've got ourselves. And so I'd have to say, in addition, that I have found these presentations incredibly valuable because of the way we try and run our business, using intergenerational debt and understanding the long-term thing. So I just wanted to thank you once again that these are incredibly valuable, and hopefully the incoming government council continues to use your services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Weber.
Oh, sorry, Suresh, Ross, if you could just flick the presentation through and we'll forward it around to the councillors. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff in there that I'd like to see. So,
absolutely. Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. In which case, I think that's the end of the questions. So there are two recommendations there. I'll look for a mover. Mayor Weber, Councillor Thwaites, and I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Well, thank you, Suresh and Marshall, and we thank you again.
No problem.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
good rest of the day.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to page 8 and the Treasury update report from David Jensen.
I'll take this report largely as read. There's two main things I'd like to cover off in this report. Firstly, you'll recall through the annual plan discussions, we made the decision to raise our interest rate assumption to 4.25%. Just highlighting the issues around interest rate risk, council's actual weighted average cost of capital is still well within that 4.25. So we feel we have covered ourselves appropriately for this this financial year. As Ross and Suresh alluded to, every time we've gone out to look at interest rates in the market, they are trending downwards over the last several months. And we believe that if we look at the swap curve, that we are well placed within our interest rate assumption to cover the debt we have. The second thing I'd like to point out is around our funding requirements for this year. So we do have a maturity of 15 million in April next year that we'll need to think about what we do with. That will largely be driven by how we go on the capital program. So you'll all be aware that through the long-term plan, we adopted a capital program that was very aggressive, and as a result, we had some debt forecasts in the long-term plan. For 2022, as we covered off last week, we only achieved 70% of that capital program. So when we are looking to borrow money and also fix our hedging, we're looking not just at what debt is now, but what debt will be in sort of 10 years' time. It requires a lot of judgment around how we think we will go achieving that capital program over the next 10 years. And we believe that we're well covered there as well. I'm happy to take any questions on this report.
Mayor Webber.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think you make a really valid point, but equally that capital program is there in our long-term plan. And I think that whilst looking at the interest, we also need to recalculate, picking up what Stuart Henderson was saying before, the inflationary impact on those projects that we need to get done is going to take the debt level or the funding requirement higher as well. So they run in tandem, and I think the next LTP is going to take a lot of discipline and reality that we've got our capital estimates right.
Yeah, and I think I'll follow that actually and say that a lot the next LTP will change a lot from the current LTP. Yes. And I'm aware that, some people are saying our debt's going to be so-and-so in 10 years' time. Well, if there's one thing that's certain is that that's not going to be the case. It's going to be different. So with Three Waters and various other reforms. So yeah, we'll have to take note of that, I think. Any other questions? Stun them into silence. So, Stuart has one. Stuart.
I'm sorry, I didn't. I couldn't quite find the little gadget soon to let you know. Some really good questions and really good comments coming through from councillors, and I think in relation to things like inflation and assuming what to use when looking forward is really difficult, especially given the current situation. And I note that in the report that David has mentioned that they have increased, or they've added a 10% factor in order to look at capital projects, and that's a really good conservative bit of stress testing, I think. From my understanding, construction inflation and for this year has certainly exceeded 15% for project and capex management that I've seen from various councils and other infrastructure projects. That it's been a factor of 15% added to significant construction projects, especially those containing steel. And I think that's a really good thing in reading that report that management have already started to factor that in. I think the Three Waters, and I was going to talk about this a little bit further in the agenda when we think about the 8 key risks that council's looking at going forward. But I think the Three Water debt is going to be a significant impact to council's balance sheet, and of course all of the mechanics that go with that in terms of forward revenue, forward expenditure and forward capex assumptions. And I was wondering, I had a conversation with David yesterday about if Bancorp were able to consider the debt forecast of council with the not only the assumption of the bow wave of capex underspend that we have, but also bearing in mind that 80% of that debt is likely to disappear in terms of July 2024. And I think it is such a big driver of a lot of the conversations going forward and strategies. Just to let councillors know, my conversations with external auditors, these are senior partners of major firms as well as Audit New Zealand, about what councils should be doing in terms of forecasting, is that the best advice is that it is the best information to hand and the most defensible information to hand is that you should be assuming the three water reform will go ahead in terms of the way you go about your long-term forecasting, i.e. that what is on the table at the moment is the best, most defensible information available to your management in being able to do longer-term forecasting. And I think that that's a really important point that's going to probably come through to local government NZ over the course of the next month or two.
Thank you, Stuart. I think that brings up a lot of points, and I think when that kicks in, it'll require a lot of consideration from the finance team about the implications of that. But Councillor Thwaites, you had a question.
Stuart, you raised a good point, and if you take that in context with what Mayor Webber described about our situation, that does add a considerable risk to this council, given that we're actually going to be on the winning side of it, and to just be very cagey about making too many commitments in that interim period, given that National and ACT have both come out and their local government spokespeople are very vehement that they will scrap Three Waters. So that opens up this 1 year window of real uncertainty and something we would need to watch carefully. Comment on that, Stuart?
Stuart, did you want to comment?
It's like looking at any market, any consideration of a central bank behaviour or any behaviour when one considers the political risks. And what we have at the moment are two different things. I can't say that that if a new government comes in between now and 2024, that we're going to see Three Waters scrapped or not, or that a new government will come in. Those are things which, when one's thinking about doing prudential forecasting. So, I mean, what I'm saying here is that if you're planning and you're planning now and you're considering planning for the future, you have to take the existing information that is the best information to hand. And what that is right now, whether or not there's a change in the political scene, is that the Three Water reform is going ahead as it has been published. And this was my question to the auditors, which was, you've got to be defensible. You've got to be making decisions that you can say, well, look, we made these decisions in good faith, defensible information. This is the best information we have to hand. Unfortunately, yes, you can always make those decisions with the view that there could be significant shift and change because of politics. But hey, if we were to do that, we wouldn't be making decisions beyond 3 yearly ones, would we? And I mean, it even goes to local government and the big changes that are occurring within local government in terms of the politics are in relation to that. So I kind of step back and look at these things and say, you only know what you know at this stage in terms of what is that best information.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chairman, I think it's time to probably shut this conversation down. I think we're in danger of relitigating some points, and we've got all our feedback in place in terms of submitting into the Three Waters proposal, all our funding mechanisms and stuff. And I think some of the stuff's a bit uncontrollable at this stage. And I'm conscious that Mr. Henderson, this is his first meeting, so obviously he's not privy to previous decisions and conversations that happen at council. But I think probably a good place to end this unless anyone else has anything to say.
So David, you had your hand up at one point. Are you okay with that? Can you put your microphone on, please?
The practical implications of what Stuart was talking about is that we are about to embark on a new long-term plan with the incoming council, which will require us to adopt some strategic assumptions up front. We are going to have to make a call well before we know anything about the final direction on Three Waters and deliver a substantial body of work before the central government elections occur. So a lot of this will be determined before we actually know a lot of information.
Thank you, David. And with that, I think we'll call for a mover and seconder on the Treasury update report. Councillor Dean, Councillor Sol, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. It's about 10:25, and that's a fairly heavy topic. So I think we'll break for morning tea at this point and pick up the quarterly review of risk profile at 10:40. So thank you very much. Okay, I think we'll have our morning tea, so we'll kick things off again, and also recognise Councillor Murray Bench has joined us. So we kick off on page 10 with the quarterly review of risk, and that is led by James Graham.
Right, councillors, I'll take the report as read. Just a quick reminder about what this report is. This is our review of our risk profile. So there's a few kind of key areas I just wanted to talk through on this report, and I'm happy to take any questions through it because it's a bit of an interactive report. It's your kind of view into the organisation around the risks and delivery strategies and the LTP in terms of our core deliveries. So just a quick reminder, over the last 6 months, we've focused on recategorising all our risks. There's a table down there, table 3, which has our 8 risk categories within them. Those, just a quick reminder, councillors have identified those risks in a workshop with KPMG, and staff have scored them, updated them, and maintained the residual risk. So that's a quick reminder of where we are. In terms of our top 8 risk categories, this next session down, the risk reporting, staff have updated from point 1 down to 5 the main risks that are currently impacting on our risk categories and delivery.
James, just before we go,
Councillor
if I may, back on page 10 or thereabouts, when you're talking about supply chain disruptions, are we adequately protected for repairs and maintenance parts for critical infrastructure, given the fact that the parts may not be so easily shipped from Auckland?
Yeah, I think our biggest issue at the moment, Councillor Granger, just I've actually, Mr. Ellis has helped me out with this piece, is actually international parts. So particularly around pumps and things like that for big capital projects, there's a 6-month delay at the moment. So we're having to be really, really careful around timing and project management of deliverables and work plans into the supply and ordering cycle. Obviously, if something breaks down in the lights, then we need to ship it, and then yes, we have a risk there. So that, yeah, so mainly international stuff, but within New Zealand, not so much.
Could I just ask James whether what the there's a formation of the Executive Risk Management Committee. May I ask who's on that? Is it the senior leadership team, or is it others?
Yes, that's correct. So I'm the chair of that meeting. All of the senior leadership team, our CEO, and we have David Sutton, who you may have remembered undertook the training for councillors and council staff. He's the partner of risk management at KPMG. He is an independent member of that forum, and David is there as well. And our risk and assurance manager, which we're very close to offering, will be the person that's responsible for the implementation of the outcomes of that forum. But that forum's main responsibility is around enabling the risk management framework, and you'll see there's a table further down which I can quickly talk through about what we've done and what we plan to do.
Yeah, because there's a comment there about the level of change management required to implement the initial steps in the risk maturity roadmap. And I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit further about how much work that is and what you've been doing.
Yeah, so one thing, maybe just a little bit of background. So when I first come into council, many of the risk reports seem to be a combination amalgam of risk issues, problems, statements, and the like. So they were very, very transactional. So to move to a more forward-looking view and a high-level view about thinking about things and actually having conversations about risk and how they impact on their strategy and looping people. And that's quite a big change in terms of how people operate and the like. So that's been one of the biggest things is the training, the education, the common terms around what risk means and understanding how that impacts on our strategy and our day-to-day operations. And we're certainly not 100% there, but I've got a feeling that we're further along than where we were 6 months ago.
Thank you. Mayor Webber.
Yeah, thanks. In the on page 10, at end, you've got operational risk, the risk of delay or inability to deliver our projects. And then you go down to the audit report, where you talk about the need for project management has come forward. And given our history of not meeting our capital commitments. Do you think we have got the urgency in place to recognise this? To me, we talked about, there's a resolution going back many years on a quarterly project management report, which obviously I'm not going to see in my time because this is our last meeting. And I just wonder whether we are taking this seriously or not, because project management in our business and for local government is, I think, an area of significant issue. And I think we need to really step it up. And I think there's not enough urgency in what's shown here is the operational risk and what's coming through in the audit report that we need to do something.
Might hand that one over to Mr. Ellis or our CEO.
Agreed. And project management is always really important in terms of managing delivery. I think it's not necessarily coming through to this committee, but the performance and monitoring committee. I think we've upped the game a lot in terms of looking at each of our projects from a time, cost and quality perspective and reporting on those parameters. So we've got a greater visibility of how the capital programs are going. In terms of the actual implementation of the project management framework, it's definitely still one of our 3 or 4 top priorities for the organisation, and we've got a external person working with us at the moment that is putting together, if you like. We've done a lot of work around our framework. Andrew's putting together some of the tools that we'll be using, so the methodology from an end-to-end basis. What we will need to make sure of is that we're using that appropriately in terms of the risk of particular projects and not over governing all of our work programs. So we'll be recognising the larger projects within the capital program, plus our internal initiatives like the HRIS system, ERP and those sorts of systems, where you'll see very, very robust project management frameworks being applied.
Thank you.
I don't see any further questions, so I'll ask for a mover for the recommendation to receive the quarterly review of council's risk profile. Mayor Webber, seconded Councillor Granger. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Sorry, Margaret, I see your hand up. Was that accidental, or did you have a question? Are you on mute?
I did have a question, and it is as we improve our performance in our health and safety and everything, can you assure me that all the departments link in together so that we don't have mistakes being made or ignorance of what's actually happening in some of our areas?
Would that be better, Margaret, is that better covered in the health and safety report?
I think, in my view, it is. Take, for example, when we did.
We'll take your question and answer during that report, Councillor Murray Benj. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Stuart, you also got your hand up. So we're trying to move on, but if it's something urgent, I'll take it.
Well, thank you, Chair. It is in relation to the overall report and the quarterly report, and I just had a couple of questions, if I could, and that is there are a couple of things which I find that broadly in local government they sometimes make that top 8 list. One of them is interconnectability and cyber security. Where does that one rank in terms of top 8 issues at the moment, please?
I'll let James handle that one.
Yes, so that one was actually specifically mentioned, Mr. Henderson, when we undertook the risk category identification with councillors. I believe Councillor Granger was one of your ones. That's actually sitting under the operational risk. If you go down under the risk name and description. So it's a good question, just to remind everyone that these operational risk categories are big items, but there are multiple risks underpinning each one. So staff are managing 5, 6, 7 or 8 different risks under each of those operational risks. Yeah, makes sense.
Yep, and I take it that's probably where something like lack of infrastructure resilience would probably sit in there as well.
Yeah, combination of climate change and that one as well. Yep.
Great, thank you. So I guess I just had one broad observation, if it's all right with you, Chair.
Please go ahead.
I thought that the residual risk on operational risk and was quite low. I often see it very much, I often see it in the medium to high categories. And there is, and I don't want to belabor the point, but where the political risk is, I think, is well, regulatory change, Three Waters, that whilst I think that is something that's very reflective, and I'm seeing a very commonality in that with other councils, I'm certainly seeing that the impact of Three Waters across some of these others has raised quite significantly the residual risk in each of them. And in particular, operational risk, health and safety in relation to staff stress around the whole integration of the new reform. And also it's raised quite a lot in terms of the growth and financial sustainability component of risk. And I was just more that I thought that they were quite low residual risk scores.
Perhaps James can quickly cover those, and then we'll Billy go on to the next topic.
I'll probably just quickly cover off the financial one and the risk fraud and all that kind of stuff in there. You've probably just heard from Bancorp say that we've got low lending, our audits, our external auditors, we don't have many issues in terms of, we don't tend to have many issues in terms of control issues at all. As you can see, we've just recently had an internal audit done on one of our key processes in terms of payroll and the likes. That's come back really, really well. So I think the score's probably fair enough in that area. Gary, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything around operational risks or the likes, because this is a shared one that I own with Gary.
No, that's that. Thank you very much.
Sure. So probably a couple from that, and one's in your area, James, is the IT risk. So the fact that the council's just entered into a contract to have a full set of our electronic information offsite and secure, and so that if the council system was ever hacked, we have a full protected system offsite that IT actually don't have access to. It has to have a senior manager log in to get access to it. So that's one of the, I guess, the protections being put in place from an IT perspective. In terms of operational risk, and I'm probably looking at delivery of our, I guess, maintenance and CapEx programs. So the maintenance programs, our key risks are probably Three Waters. Not probably from what Stuart was talking about, but more about ensuring that we're meeting our compliance standard for safe delivery of water. And we've talked about that before, about going safe drinking water is one of the key things that we as an organisation do, and that's a high focus. And delivery of the capital programs, it is sometimes it's a bit of a lottery, but we've got a program in place and we do a monthly tracking, as the Mayor's talking about in terms of project management. We do a monthly tracking of our capital program to look at this against targets and against where we think we should be sitting in terms of expenditure. So while you get a quarterly report, we're doing that monthly just to see we're on track and are able to do early interventions in terms of delivery.
Thank you, Gary. Right, well, having received the report, I think we're going to move on. So if we move on now to the item 9.3, update on outstanding audit items on page 20. David, you're introducing this one, please.
So ordinarily, at this time of the year, we would have had Audit New Zealand come through for 2 interim visits, and they'll be in the beginning of their final visit. A number of items in this report are assumed closed pending audit confirmation. Unfortunately, due to audit resourcing pressures, they aren't going to be visiting us until much later. So a number of these items remain closed pending audit confirmation until those tests can be done. And we await the arrival of audit to conclusively remove those from the register going forward. But I'm happy to take any questions on the report going on the other items.
Any questions? Councillor Granger.
Mr. Chair, I just wondered whether this was a good time for David or James to inform us of where the current state is of Audit New Zealand and our likelihood of us getting an audit out by due date, so that other councillors are aware of what's going on.
I think that would be a very apposite question to ask.
Do you mind repeating the question, Mr. Granger?
If you could just give us, all the councillors, an update on what the current state of play is with Audit New Zealand and our chances of actually getting an audit before due date. Thanks.
If you recall, a few meetings ago, we had Leon and Warren present a draft audit plan with some indicative dates showing a final visit in September. And unfortunately, those dates will not be met. Audits have informed us that they are heavily involved in the merger with the Polytech. They're heavily involved in the mergers with the DHBs, on top of a enormous resource pressure and not being able to attract staff from overseas, which is their traditional business model. They usually bring in people from other Commonwealth countries. We do not have dates when they will visit. We understand it'll be in the new calendar year, and we are awaiting news from Audit New Zealand around when they can resource us adequately, and we'll be negotiating with them around when they can come in. We need to get the annual report signed off, but we also need to make sure that the process doesn't complicate the business around other things we'll be doing at the same time, especially with the new annual plan and beginning of the long-term plan. And so we'll be negotiating with Audit around when we sign off that annual report.
CEO John Holyoake.
Just to round out part of your question, Councillor Granger, legislatively, we should have our report signed off by December. We won't meet that deadline, but as you've heard, it's totally out of our control.
Sorry, just and further to John's comment, if you look at the annual report for Whakatane for 2021, you'll see in the audit report they have an additional paragraph stating that they adopted their annual report late because of audit pressure. I'd expect us to have a similar paragraph in our audit opinion for 2022.
And if there's any comfort, the auditors have said that they've dropped the best performing councils down the line because they're less urgent. So almost a good thing, I suppose. But it would have been nice to get it audited on time. That also means that for everyone's information, we had planned to have auditors at only time at or following this meeting, but because the auditors haven't had a chance to visit, that has been postponed. Mayor Webber.
Yeah, thanks. And I suppose this is a question to you, Stuart, more than anyone. You know, we as a council, we sit in our little silo, think we're doing well. One of the reasons for an independent is you are playing in a wider or in more silos than we are. Do you see this as an ongoing issue, and what do you think the time? Because I don't think this is going to be resolved in 2 or 3 years. And given, in my opinion, the auditors have done an abysmal job in auditing councils, and I use the Hamilton City example where they've got $1 billion of unfunded capital, and the auditors seem comfortable with that. When do you think we're going to get some diligence in auditing in New Zealand?
What I can answer to that through the chair is that the situation is systemic with local government. Unfortunately, local government is at the bottom of the queue. It comes to for Audit New Zealand and the Office of the Auditor General, it's the priorities are government and government departments, and then it's coming down the list. Local government is down on that list, and the problems that you're experiencing now are very similar to those that the rest of the sector had been experiencing. As I say, I'm chair of Whakatane District Council's Risk Audit Committee. We only just got our 2021 accounts signed off. And that audit process didn't actually begin until January of this year. Now, you've in the past got a very good reputation as a council. You're held very highly in the sector broadly as a council in relation to matters of audit, and I think that the internal audit process that's been discussed by management is also much ahead of the pack. You'll not meet. I don't think many councils are going to meet the statutory requirement of having the audit completed by December. My advice is that you get on with what you're doing, make the plans with the external auditor so that you're not wasting your time racing around for an internal audit, for an external auditor that's not ready or resourced to do the job. And so it's going to be connectivity between yourselves and Audit New Zealand. I don't see their problem solving itself for a few years, because their problem is also a major problem with the whole audit sector. And at the moment, we've seen a continued exodus of audit people in the last 3 to 4 months, but we haven't had those people replenished. And it's going to be a case of getting, I'm sorry to say, bums on seats.
However,
Yeah, a supplementary, but we're proud of what we've achieved over the last 6 to 9 years. And is there anything that you would suggest we should do to belt and braces to make sure that we don't slide back for want of an oversight from outside? Is there anything else we could do to substitute that lack of the Office of the Auditor General? Is there another avenue we should be looking at?
My initial thoughts are that you are actually doing that in terms of, from my conversations with David, in terms of the way you're approaching the internal audit process. And I think that correct me if I'm wrong, please, David, but you're in the process of perhaps getting a risk manager that's going to be your internal audit champion. And I think that the robustness of the way that you'll take that process forward will probably be the best counter to having an external audit process that's a little bit less than what you'd want.
Thank you.
You're taking care of it yourself. It's, so as a first line of defence. And I think that that's a good initiative.
thank you, Stuart. I'm not seeing any further questions, so I'll call for a mover to receive the update on outstanding audit items report, please. Councillor Thwaites, Councillor Sol, all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay, I'll now ask James to introduce the next item on health and safety report.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got Ben, our health and safety guru, here with us. As you see, he actually works in the field and does his job. So well done, Ben. I'll hand over to Ben to give a quick update on his report now.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone, for having me here. So the report's gone out as requested by Mayor Webber. I've done some comparison graphs from Q3 to Q4 on event reporting. You see that there's been an increase in event reporting, which is excellent because we don't know, we can't fix at the end of the day. and a really big increase from our contractors, which is something we've been engaging our contractors, our key contractors like EnviroWaste and Downer, about their low reporting numbers. So they're on board, which is excellent news. In relation to our, I suppose, our lag indicators, we're performing really well. So that's our TRIFR and our lost time injuries. We're either at or under the expected levels of comparative organisations, councils, etc. So again, a really good thing. And health and safety in general, I suppose. Last time I spoke, I talked about we've adopted a health and safety vision statement, which is together we get our people home safe and well every day. That's something we're trying to champion at council, taking that to the individual groups and departments, speaking to that and really focusing on giving our people a voice is a big part of it. So speaking up, whether that to managers, to colleagues, or to myself, and how we can get better engagement in that space. But I don't think there's much more to add technically from me, but I'm happy to take any questions or feedback.
Thank you, Ben. I'll kick the first question off. So the large increase in contractor events, could you talk a little bit more around that and why that's gone up so much?
Yeah, I'll say partially that's down to the time of the reporting. At the time of the previous reporting, it might have been in between when we receive our events from contractors, because we receive them at the end of every month, unless there's a significant event that we need to know about and that gets entered into our system. So we're sharing and collaborating. But also there's a big drive from those larger organisations because, to be fair, they're doing the doing and doing predominantly high risk work on roadsides, vehicles, using mobile plant, etc. So they also saw that there was a significant drop off in reporting and have been championing that at their toolboxes or at their regional or department meetings as well. So it's a collaboration. So when I meet with them regularly, we talk about what the reports are coming in, what's been the outcomes, is there room for improvement?
So it's the timing of reports, and also would you say it's more to do with them being more upfront about what's been happening rather than more injuries happening, should we say?
I don't think it's them being more upfront. I think we have a good, honest relationship because they've got to report and we just receive what they're reporting to themselves. So I think it's education. And it's the same thing as what we're trying to champion here is making sure your people have a voice. And if they see things are improving, then they're more likely to speak up about it.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm conscious that Councillor Murray-Benge was going to speak about health and safety in the previous report. So I'll let her come in now, if you would, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was really concerned about the mental health of our staff in relation to this dog issue. Tell me, could we have, as you're responsible now for these graphs, and what are we doing to ensure that our staff do not have mental health problems and that we move fast enough to actually get control of the issue rather than having our staff become the victims?
Yes, no problem. Thank you, Councillor. In the instance of the animal services, actually, when you look back at, and we went back through the process, the animal services team actually acted excellently. They had a plan. Sorry, they had a plan in place, a safety plan. It was prepared. They had engaged the police. They knew they needed to be in numbers. They had duly informed themselves and customer service of the likelihood of bounce back from the customer they were dealing with. We do have processes in place around mental health, and a lot of that is having those open, honest conversations with each other, offer of follow-up support through mental health agencies, and debriefing certain events like this one is a really good chance for people to, and the workers involved, to air what went well and what didn't go well so that the process can be improved next time round. But I agree with you, mental health is a big concern across the board. It's not just a workplace thing, it's a at-home thing, but that all affects how you are at work as well. So that's a challenge for lots of organisations, and it's definitely something we're keen to keep investing in and keep working on how we can do better.
Mr. Chairman, as I read the report, I just felt for our staff having to cope with some nutter in the community. And I felt, have you really resolved the issue? And because all you're doing is adding mental anguish to our staff who have to deal with it. So have the police resolved the issue, sir?
In this instance, yes, the police have resolved the issue. I can't get into it too much more than that, but the police have dealt with the offender, and no further incidences of that behaviour have happened since the dogs were seized.
Oh, thank you.
That's good to hear. Now, I had Deputy Mayor Scrimger has his hand up. So what was your question, please?
Yeah, thanks, James. Just essentially following up from your question, Ben, you talked about the big uptick in reporting, particularly from the contractors, of incidents and near misses. And just wondering about going forward, how to maintain that reporting level, because it's very human nature. It's very easy to drift back into old habits and have it tail off again. So I was just wondering what plans you've got in place to try and keep that momentum going.
Yeah, really good question. I like to focus on, we do have good engagement from contractors, and because the events coming in from them are part of their business, we're really focusing on the events coming in from our people. And you can see there was an increase, not significant, but not insignificant. If you look at it, it's a 40% of event reporting. For me, it's really gaining traction by engaging and working with our health and safety reps. So we have reps across the organisation. We have about 16 health and safety trained reps in different parts of council, different area offices, and different parts of the business. So it's about keeping them upskilled, keeping them engaged. So then health and safety is always it's in every area. So there's always a rep in every place that can either be available to be spoken to, or can be doing site visits themselves or workplace assessments, and being readily available to the staff all across the district, not just myself trying to get out east and out west for every event. So that's the tactic that I'm using at the moment. So we're meeting one-on-one with the reps to see what additional skills or additional training that they would like in that space, meeting with departments to let them know who the reps are, empowering our workers and our reps to actually get out and have those conversations. It doesn't have to be started for any other reason other than you're interested in what someone's doing. So I think using our voice, having those open, honest conversations, and trusting that anything that's actually said is going to benefit the worker. It's not going to create a culture of blame. It's more about a culture of trust. I hope that answers that.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, independent member Henderson, please.
Thank you. Through the chair, if I could ask Ben, do we track the physical and verbal abuse to staff and contractors as an event?
Yes, we do. We do capture that as a safety event. It's one of our critical risks that we identified at council, and it's something that I think I know most council, it's one of the things that we are trying our best to manage, because it's hard to control another person's behaviours. But it's how we can manage the environment that we work in, and how we can manage the wraparound services for our staff. So yes, it's definitely something that we do acknowledge, and we are working with some external trainers in relation to ongoing training for new staff, and continuous improvement training for dealing with aggressive customers and situational awareness.
Thank you.
Councillor Dean.
Missing from the report is anything about sickness. Have we got any measure of staff sick days and sick leave? And then I could even go further and say, what about staff fitness? Do we track that at all?
I think Councillor, the CEO wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, good question given the current environment that we're in. with a lot of sickness going around. So actually, I haven't got it in front of me. And I can provide a little bit more detail, but I asked for some figures last week. And what I can say is that our current level of sickness trending for the last 2 or 3 months compared to the same months last year is about 50% up. Okay, we don't measure fitness, but I'm pretty good. Just to say.
Just a supplementary on that, how are we going with staff sick leave days? Because if people have been off with these winter colds, flus and things, they must be using up their sick leave. And are we in danger of people having no sick leave left?
We are, but we're not in danger of that being an implication for them. So we're treating COVID sick differently. Because it's a new thing, and so we're treating that quite differently. The other, we have other mitigations in place. We, in terms of, look, we basically take the view that if someone's sick, they're sick, and if they're truly sick and can't be at work, then we are responsive to that in terms of not cutting into annual leave or having an effect on their pay. So we take a mature, flexible approach to our sick leave.
Mayor Webber.
Yeah, I think it would be appropriate for us as a council to give a degree of comfort to the staff that what they do, we're in unprecedented times, and your point is valid. A lot of people are coming up against this sick leave, but we still have to run the business. And I think staff need to understand that we support that approach you're taking, in that we have to be as flexible as we can. It's hard to manage, I accept, because some people bend the rules, but in the main, I think it's genuine, and just give staff the support that we're comfortable with the approach they've taken around the COVID pandemic.
I think that's a sensible approach, Mayor Webber, and I don't think now is the time to be ultra strict with staff on the sick leave, because I think that'd be counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve.
Just add one thing further to the CEO's comments, and it's something actually John's instituted, and I think it's really good, is the COVID sick leave is treated differently from leave, because the last thing you want is people coming in to the office that are low on sick leave because with COVID. So I think it's, for the purposes of our business, it makes sense not to adopt them for that.
Councillor Daly.
Ben, just in relation to Stuart's question relating to verbal abuse, that doesn't seem to show up in any of the charts, unless it's the mental health one under types of injuries requiring treatment.
I can definitely add it as its own tower, but at the moment it's just captured as an event. So yeah, unless there's injury that comes from it, that would separate into a different tower. But yeah, as you'll see, I created its own stat around mental health because I thought that was important to identify as it being slightly different. But yeah, more than happy to break it down. I guess it's where do we stop breaking the events down into individual events from there? But yeah, if that's something that interests the elected members, no problem.
Anything on that? If that's something that's easy to do, then I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Yeah, thank you. If there's no further questions, I will call for a move and second on the health and safety report, please. Councillor Sol, Councillor Dean, all those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. All right, so that comes to the end of the open part of the meeting. I now move that we'll go into the confidential section, seconded